Hello and welcome back to Marineford TCG. My name is Joe. Drink of the day is Dr. Aloe Mango Flavoured Aloe Vera drink. And now that PRB has been out for a week, I've decided to do a tier list with my initial thoughts on where I think this format is headed. Because, long story short, I don't think a whole lot changes this meta, honestly. The PRB02 cards are nice, but I think specifically the top decks don't really change too much. And this starting tier list is about where the last format ended, OP12. This is based on the data from Eggman events. This contenders tier down here is the decks that got buffed in PRB that I want to talk about. So don't worry about these ones, we'll get to those. But based on the number of tops from Eggman events that these decks got in regionals, I've put together this tier list along with some slight adjustments for where I feel the meta was at the end of the meta. For example, Shanks was doing very, very well at the start of the OP12 meta, but as the format developed and UP Luffy started doing incredibly well again, Shanks' success dramatically fell off because that matchup is horrible. That matchup is horrible. And also, UP Luffy, I think towards the end of the format, it was very clear that this, in my opinion, is the best deck. Bonnie probably a close second, and then Zoro and Rayleigh just behind. GP, I think was a good bit weaker than these four. The numbers showed that if you watched my OP12 by the numbers tier list. But it didn't feel very fair to put him in tier 2, so I've put him right at the bottom of top tier GP. One deck that started doing a lot better towards the end of the format was Calgara. Calgara got some solid buffs in OP12, has a very solid package, and has a good matchup into UP Luffy. And there's not that many decks that do have a good matchup into UP Luffy. So we did start seeing a little bit more Calgara success towards the end of the format, which was pretty cool to see. Regardless, if there's any topping decks from OP12 that you think I've missed, please let me know, and maybe I'll put a pin in the comments where I think they should be going forwards. And starting off, I'm going to start off by talking about the decks on the tier list that I think will improve or deteriorate with the new cards. And I think we need to start with RG Smoker. RG Smoker, of course, gained quite a few new cards from the new set. Primarily that Lore and the 4-cost Kobe. Both of those cards look to be mainstays in the deck. And I think they do serve to both increase his consistency in general, especially the Lore being double searchable off Virgo and Perona. Kobe giving him actual draw is like so good for this deck. Because you are a full life leader and you rely on playing a lot of cards to get the extra value out of those dons, you would sort of just run out of cards quite rapidly. So Kobe being a 7k base power unit is quite hard to destroy by battle and can refill your hand, I think does give this deck a lot more longevity. And both those cards combined with obviously things like Mole Pistol make this feel a lot more like control-y than just an aggro beatdown deck with the 5-cost Smoker. How good do I think it's going to make him? I definitely think it's going to make him at least in the tier 2 category. I do still have some concerns about the consistency of this deck. It very much still feels like if you don't see your play on 5 or 6, you're just going to lose. The Mihawks are obviously incredibly powerful, but again, they're only single searchable, and your searches do still whiff with this deck. You still whiff searches way, way more than I'd like. Most of these other top decks, the ones that play searches, like Zoro, when was the last time you whiffed a Perona? Like, it just doesn't happen. But in Smoker, you're whiffing searches fairly frequently, which I really don't like personally, because it does impact the consistency of the deck. I do think he will be a solid pick, though. I'd be willing to put him near the top of tier 2, with the new buffs increasing his power level. You've always sort of had a decent Bonnie matchup, as well as Luffy. However, the Zoro matchup can be a little tricky, and the Rayleigh matchup is still pretty not amazing. If you can find that Kobe early on, and it survives, then you're in a pretty good spot versus Rayleigh. But the fact that if you're playing the Virgo and the Perona build, as most Smoker builds are at the minute, the fact that the Kobe is unsearchable is just not great, and he is still vulnerable to Mole Pistol that Rayleigh does play. I think into Rayleigh, you are still going to struggle, even though you have that Kobe, just because of the consistency issues in actually finding him and keeping him safe till he can do anything. It's not like in Kobe Leader, where the 4-cost Kobe can attack immediately. Smoker does need that turn where the Kobe survives. So for me, I'm going to put him at the top of tier 2. I could see him dropping a couple spaces or maybe even going up in tier 1 if his matchup into Bonnie and UP Luffy is important enough. But I do have some concerns about the Zoro and Rayleigh matchup, so I think tier 2 is the highest I can put him right now. Shanks did gain buffs. He gained the Kobe, he gained the Law, and the Lucky Roo. However, as long as Luffy is just the best deck in the game, and I don't foresee that changing massively in this set, I think Shanks is going to be struggling. You do still have a good matchup into Bonnie. You've got a very playable matchup into Rayleigh. Very playable matchup into GP. Zoro can be a little bit tricky, although I do think the tank builds make that matchup a lot more winnable. But the UP Luffy matchup is just unwinnable, so I don't think his position will really change that much. Maybe I'll put him up a little bit above like Sanji, because of the law making those matchups where you do need to be controlling a lot easier. But until UP Luffy like dies off, this deck's never going to be top tier again. Alas, because I love him. Let's talk about Nami. I think the Marco's a nice little buff. I don't think she's going to be that much better. I think the Marco is a powerful card for the deck, but I don't think it doesn't like fix a matchup, right? It just makes the general power level a little bit higher. That Marco coming in is nice, consistency buff for the deck, bit of a power level rise, but it doesn't particularly help with any of the more difficult matchups that you had. So I don't really see her place in the meta changing that much. Really need that young girl, man. If we had that young girl instead of Teach, I still don't think it changes the deck like that. I still don't think it changes the deck that much, but it just increases the power level again just a little bit. Maybe we could have seen Nami towards the middle or top of tier 2. However, I really do hope we see some success for Nami because the deck's really fun. Pudding. I think I'm going to leave Pudding in Rogue, but I might put her more towards the top of Rogue. This deck, I would not be surprised to see this top. All the decks on this tier list have topped in the previous format, OP12. And I would not be surprised to see Pudding top, maybe even a couple of times in PRB. That new 7-cost Pudding is really nice. Just give you something else to do and increase the draw of Pudding. Because, again, as a full life leader, you do run out of resources. So you need some way to refill your hand. Red Green Smoker does it with the Kobe now. Blue Yellow Nami has a leader effect. GP Luffy, every fucking card in the deck draws a card. And Pudding now has that 7-cost Pudding to both cheat out the cat and potentially a turn early, as well as draws a couple cards. 10 Mum spam is very good into, like, Luffy. However, Bonnie is still a pretty difficult matchup, in my opinion. You don't have a good way to deal with 8-cost Kid, and also your cards can very easily get either locked down by Doflamingo or removed by 9-cost Shanks, making the matchup pretty difficult. I think you've got a reasonable time to Zoro, because you just like to heal, and Zoro doesn't generally like decks that like to heal. So spamming 10 Mum, like Kumas, and even Yellow 8 Cat to push things to your life is pretty good in that matchup. Rayleigh is another difficult matchup, though. I don't think Pudding just has that many good matchups among the top decks. So that's why I can't really put her any higher than Rogue. Although it must be said that into some of these tier 2 decks, things like Shanks, and even things like Anel, you actually have a pretty good time into those, because they don't love having their life be trashed. I guess we can talk about the top decks. Bonnie gained the 3-cost Bonnie. It was already debatable whether she was number 1 or number 2. I'm still going to leave her at number 2 just because I think UP Luffy is more consistent. But that 3-cost Bonnie playing around green decks, being able to rest the Don and the blocker at the same time, will be pretty nice for dealing with Hody Jones and DMG in green mirrors. I still personally just think UP Luffy's better, purely because it's more consistent. Too many unsearchables in Bonnie for me to want to play the deck. They're all very, very good. They're all very, very powerful. And the leader is clearly no joke. I would give it number 2 in this format. But I just don't love that all the cards that you want to see pretty much are unsearchable. The Mihawk, the Dofi, the Shanks, 9-cost Zoro if you run that one. They're all unsearchable, which just, it kind of sucks, man. It kind of sucks. However, I still think she will be number 2. There's nothing comes out that just destroys this deck that doesn't just lose to UP. So I think Bonnie will be cemented very solidly at number 2, with that new Bonnie especially. Also gains the Zoro 2k. I don't know how impactful that's going to be. All these green decks gain that one. I don't think it really changes very much, in all honesty. UP Luffy could play the Dofi blocker, but again, he's already number 1. His position doesn't need to change. I wonder if Rayleigh could ever play the Kobe for Mirror. That'd be quite interesting. That'd be quite funny, actually. If you're a Rayleigh player and you've tried the 4-cost Kobe in your deck, let me know. Blackbeard does gain that new Shiryu blocker, which will help him in pretty much exclusively the Rayleigh matchup. This doesn't really change the deck's position at all. I think tier 2 is solid for Blackbeard. He's decent into some decks and dreadful into others. It's just kind of how he's always been. So I think that's it for the decks that got buffed. I can't see any here that I really wanted to talk about that I didn't. Kuzan gains the Marco. Maybe I'll put him above Saka. I don't think this changes much for Kuzan. It's a nice little 4-cost though. That Marco. Really good card. Very impressed with him, of course, as the as the markets reflect, you know. Right, Doflamingo gained that new Jinbei. I don't think this really changes much. I do have a little bit of hope that you could start seeing more people at least try the deck. Because I think the deck should have been at least Rogue last format. But I just don't think people are really playing this deck because obviously since the Jinbei bans, he's been not in a great spot. However, I'd give this guy at least Rogue. We'll put him somewhere in the middle of Rogue. I really hope we get some Doflamingo experts back on the deck. Try and cook him up. Because I think you've got some pretty decent matchups in the top decks. Your Luffy matchup, you're very aggressive with spamming a lot of guys. And into Rayleigh, that 4-cost Law is just going to be pretty good for destroying all of their stuff. Although the GP matchup was always pretty tricky back in PRB02. So that could be one deck that is keeping him out a little bit. Bonnie as well. Again, you can't really deal with 8-cost Kid. It's kind of tough. Moria, this is my cope deck. I love this leader. I love this leader. I don't think he's going to top. I really don't think he's going to top. The deck's just not... There's a lot of people that love him, though. I'll put him at the bottom of Rogue. I'll put him above, like, Koala. I'll put him here. I'll put him here. I would not be surprised if this doesn't top at all. I love the leader. I think it's really good fun. But he's still just missing something. That new 6-cost Moria is a great tool. But it doesn't fix, like, the fundamental sort of... But this guy kind of has, like, a identity crisis. Old black leaders all about removal. This guy seems to want to be like an aggro black deck with some removal. But the removal he has is just so bad, and because there's not that much of it, it feels very inconsistent. If you don't see your Absaloms, you don't see your Hinas, you're shit out of luck. You're not removing anything. And the sort of aggro tempo plays he has, like the 4-cost Perona and the 4-cost Ryuma, they're just not that good. They're fine. They're fine, but they're very vulnerable to like getting arrested by Zoro, getting blown up by Godthread against Luffy. The 5k ones obviously kind of suck into GP because he's a 6k leader. And so I really don't think I can give this guy any higher than Rogue, but he's very, very fun. If you enjoy black decks, give Moria a go this format. He's a great laugh. Really cool leader. And OP14, please. Give us some more Thriller Barks. Give us more Thriller Barks. Come on. I believe. Marco. I think I'll put Marco near the top of Rogue as well. This guy has historically done very well into purple Luffy type decks. However, with the introduction of UP Luffy now playing the Mihawk more consistently, and less success for both purple Luffy and black purple Luffy, it kind of makes Marco suffer a little bit. The Mihawk just being able to remove their 7-cost Nugate is so important, because before, when they were playing like the 9 Mum and the 8 Cat, they couldn't deal with 7-cost Nugate. It was too big to attack, and also too big to remove with 9 Mum. So that guy got to stick, then you went Rayleigh, and you could often remove 2 things, which was pretty incredible. That said, he does gain a new 4-cost Marco, and I've seen a few people talking about Marco online. I would not be surprised to see some more Marco representation, and I would not be surprised to maybe even see him top. Where in Rogue we're going to put him? I think I'll put him here below, maybe below Lim. Buggy's probably too high. Let's move Buggy down. I don't think Buggy's very good. Yeah, I'll put him in the middle of Rogue, near Doflamingo. I think both these decks have a lot more potential than we're seeing at the minute. But until we start seeing results, it's very hard to put them higher. Marco also just has some pretty tough matchups into decks like Zoro. And of course, things like Blackbeard are pretty difficult for Marco to deal with, because he does pretty much rely on plays a lot. However, if you can dodge those decks and hit like a bunch of Luffys and GPs, you could go pretty far with Marco. I think the deck is still very good at dealing with these purple Luffys, just a little bit worse now if they are on the Mihawk. Although they're not always all on the Mihawk now. You do start seeing more builds dropping the Mihawk for more emphasis on the Don Quixote Pirates cards, and also the Rush cards like the Luffy and the Akos Luffy. So I think Marco has potential to top, especially with that new 4-cost Marco giving him a couple extra draws here and there. Purple-black Luffy gained just the Searcher, really. Oh, GP gained the Searcher as well. This is just a consistency buff. It doesn't change the deck very much. He was already, like, solidly 5th. We'll leave him solidly 5th. I forgot about that little Nami Searcher. But back to Purple-black Luffy. I don't think this really changes anything for the deck. I'll put him at the bottom of Rogue. I'll put him here, I guess. I think Bello Betty at least has like a defined role that she just beats UP and is pretty good into GP. Whereas the Purple Black Luffy, he's very exploitable. Zoro being able to rest down their guys and attack them even with the increased cost is pretty annoying. UP, again, if they're playing Mihawk, can now remove Beer Luffy, which was like your main tool into them, and to help you win. Rayleigh can still just be a bit too far sometimes, and they have Mole Pistol to remove that Beer Luffy, which is not good. So, whilst I think his consistency will increase a little bit from being able to run extra searches in the Nami, I don't think his power level is going to change very much at all. Now let's move into more interesting decks. Kobe has been pretty bad since release, which is a shame because this deck is a lot of fun. He's always been like a okay sort of locals rogue deck, but you never see him do that well at regionals. However, that new 4-cost Kobe does increase his consistency and card draw quite a lot. It works alongside the 4-cost Kuzan to give you a second thing to do on 4, so it's not just Kuzan or bust anymore. And the fact that it lets you pop chump blockers into decks like Bonnie, and actual meaningful characters into decks like Rayleigh, and then also just draw you cards in other matchups, is pretty good. I do still think the UP matchup is awful. I have played that quite a few times now on Ranked. It just doesn't feel very good. It's got too much counter. Their characters are all very, very large, so they're hard to deal with by battle, which is really what you're trying to do with Kobe. And we don't have the aggression to sort of like rush them down like other red decks might do, like Rayleigh. So I think that matchup's tricky. I think Zoro is still pretty difficult. They get to play your board and your life. You're just playing their board usually. So I do think they are generally just Kobe but better. However, I think Kobe at least has some pretty winnable matchups into like GP. You can aggress their board pretty nicely. Bonnie is also not too bad. You've got power down to deal with things like Kid and Mihawk. You don't get too boned by things like Doflamingo because all your guys have some kind of inherent rush. However, do we think he's good enough for Great? I'll put him in Great. I'll put him right at the bottom of Great. I think people will play Kobe. Will he top though? He probably won't top. He's still a bit mid. He's still a bit mid. It's a lovely buff, that 4-cost Kobe, but I don't have the faith in him. Although I really hope we do see some Kobe tops. I know there's a couple of top players who really enjoy this deck. So if one of those decides to bring this to a regional and does well, maybe we could see him in Great. But I think if he is going to top, it'll be a limited number. So we'll put him at the top of Rogue for now. I think that's fine. Purple Katakuri. I actually think he's slightly better than Pudding. I think his leader effect is generally just stronger. You can still gain life with the 9 Mum. You have access to some pretty cool cards like the 5-cost Perospero that Pudding can't play. And you both have more resources, you have extra power to be able to play big guys and still attack for a good number with your leader. The extra knowledge you gain in the hands of a skilled pilot can really give you a lot of knowledge on going for lethal at the end of the game. 7-cost Pudding is a lovely little buff for this deck. I don't think it changes too much, but I do think it's a nice consistency buff and extra draws. You have access to some pretty cool cards, right? You've got like the ACOS casters are pretty good into UP Luffy, especially because you can punish them for ramping by playing that Pudding early to get down a bunch of blockers before they can get down much of anything. Into Zoro, you've got that extra life, and 9 Mum is very nice into Zoro. Being able to remove their Shigis and Cavendishes and heal is really, really strong. And into Rayleigh, you can even play cards like Ikoku, is it Hakai Sovereignty? Ikoku Sovereignty? The one that's like Gravity Blade Raging Tiger, the 6-cost event. That's a really nice card for dealing with things like Rayleigh and GP Luffy. So I do think Katakuri has some promise. I think the power level of the deck is a little too low for me to put him any higher than sort of near the bottom of Great. However, would not be surprised to see this deck top at all. I think that pudding is a solid buff. Let's talk about the brothers next. Ace, I'm going to put right at the bottom of Rogue. I still think this deck is bad, and to be honest, if he doesn't seem to want to go at the bottom of Rogue. What's going on with this? Why won't you go at the bottom of Rogue? Like you're leaving him in contenders. This leader I just don't think is very good. The 5-cost Ace is a good buff. Like, if you want to play one of these life manipulation, power increase brothers type decks, I really don't see a reason to play Ace. Sometimes you can just lose from your leader effect whiffing, and if you're using something like Teach, put cards on top of your deck to stop your leader effect whiffing, well, then you're going minus cards in hand with a deck that already doesn't have that many cards in hand because you're a full life leader. It's like, yes, you sort of gain extra life with leader effect, but you're still using cards from your hand to play those like big brothers that you're finding. So I really just don't think this deck's very good. However, if you are an Ace enjoyer, don't get me wrong, that Ace is a nice little buff for this deck. I just don't think it's going to top. I'd be very, very surprised to see blue-yellow Ace top. Red-yellow Sabo, I think, has a little bit more promise. I still don't think he's very good. We managed to get away for them to go at the bottom. There we go. I'll put these two at the bottom of Rogue. I don't expect we'll see these top. And to be honest, if you want to put these in a tier below Rogue, you certainly could. I don't know, though, to be fair, there's a couple of decks in Rogue that I don't think will top either. Looking at you, Starlink 21. But yeah, I think, again, the Ace is a nice little buff, but we're just not seeing anything at all from either of these leaders beforehand. And it's not like a deck changer. It's not a build around. However, for black yellow Luffy, I think this is sort of a build around. I'm going to put him at the bottom of Great. People love this deck. There are a lot of people in the West that just love this leader. I don't know why. This is probably my top 3 most hated leaders, personally. I find it so dull to play into. But I do understand there is a lot of really good players that love like the expression you get when you're playing this leader yourself. So as a result, I think a lot of people will put a lot of time into making this work, even though this is probably a 1-month leader, because OP13 just completely changes the game again. I do expect this guy to top, purely because I think the volume of people trying to make this work is going to be quite high. I do still foresee some difficult matchups, particularly UP Luffy, just playing out like 9,000 power characters. It means that when you go to 9k, it's not that impactful, you know? Also, I think Bonnie can be quite tricky for this deck as well. Being able to rest your blockers if you attack after using your leader effects can make it pretty difficult. As well as the 10-cost Doflamingo freezing a lot of your aggression out can be pretty difficult to deal with. However, I very much expect Black Yellow Luffy to see some success. I think your Rayleigh matchup should be quite reasonable just because you go very large, so long as you don't get aggroed down too fast. And also into GP, a lot of their closers, things like DMG, are very expensive. And 6-cost Luffy, unless they can get it on the board a turn earlier, is not going to be that powerful. Because when you're at 9k, 7k rush unit just suddenly isn't that scary anymore. Which is quite amusing. I think this guy definitely has the power. Now that you have a way to reuse those 2-cost brothers, it's going to be actually fairly consistent at doing what it wants to do. It's just much less powerful than when we still had Moria and like Rhaego and things like that. So I think top of Great is maybe a little generous, but we'll say I do expect results from Black Yellow Luffy. And finally, I've been seeing some murmurings about Sanji. I'm not personally a believer until I see it. Every time I've played this leader in the past, it felt really bad. And I've played into a few in ranked, and it's not out that great. However, I think I'll give him at least the nod of Rogue. I'll put him here with Marco and Doflamingo. Does gain access to really those 2 red cards, both the Kobe and the Law. The Law is especially nice because one thing that Sanji really struggled with is if you can just remove their stuff, they just kind of lose because they run out of cards. And that leans back into the Kobe, right? The Kobe draws cards. The Law is unremovable. So I think both those decks are very, very solid for Sanji. I just don't think Play Guy and Rush is necessarily going to be good enough when you could just play Rayleigh. Like, this is just a better aggressive deck in my mind. So I don't know why I'd be playing Sanji when I could just be playing Rayleigh. They're both aggro decks, but this one just has a million more cards. It's much more consistent because you've got 1,000 searchers. And you also have infinite counter with Conqueror's Haki. So for me, this is just like a really poor man's Rayleigh. Although I'm really excited to see if people can cook something up with him. Because the lists I've been seeing going around are pretty cool. Pretty cool to see. Either way, that is going to be my tier list. I don't think the top of the meta really changes a lot. I think the biggest buff in this set is probably Smoker and maybe then Black Killer Luffy. I'd expect those will be the decks that will see the most tops relative to where they were before. Also have some pretty good hopes for Katakuri. The rest of these buffs, I think, don't really change their leaders much from Rogue, but would love to be proven wrong. I love seeing off-meta and Rogue decks top these regionals. So I'm really excited to see if these PRB buffs do have more of an impact than I'm expecting. Thank you for watching. Let me know where you disagree with me in the comments. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.